Okay, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ki Fateh. Selena looked a bit nervous there. She's got half that stuff mixed up. Anyway, look, thanks for coming. We have got esteemed guests today, so I want to thank everyone for turning up today. David Young from the ABF Soldiers Charity, Mr. Resham Sandhu, Sukhdev Singh Bansal, and members from the Punjab Arts Council, and all the students from various universities for attending today. I was told to talk about a subject that I've been researching on for the last, 25 years? And it's true, the more deeper you go, the more addictive it gets. And for some people, I asked Selena, what theme do you want for me to talk on? He goes, look, some of the students don't even know much about the Sikh Empire. And I suppose it's a subject for the last 15 years. A lot of interest has been building up with relics, artifacts. Suddenly, at the auction houses today, anything connected with Ranjit Singh's empire, the zeros are added on. What is about this king, this figure, this personality, that 180 years after his death, there's still so much interest? And yet, a lot of people do not know how the empire was formed, how the empire, just within a matter of 5 years, disintegrated. And so, I'm fortunate to have gone to Pakistan for the last 25 years. I make 3 trips a year, because when you go to Lahore, trust me, it's like a magnet. It just pulls you in. And when you sit there outside the Lahore fort, and you reminisce about what could have been, this was the empire of the Sikhs. How did we just give it away? I sit outside the tomb of Ranjit Singh and I just go into a trance that what could have been. So I hope by the time you leave here today, I'm not going to go into details because we don't have time, but I'm going to give you a summary of how the empire was formed, the origin of Sikh power, the expansion of the Sikh empire, the intrigues and the assassinations that followed, and the slow disintegration of the empire and the exile of Maharaja Dalip Singh to England. Before we talk about Ranjit Singh, we need to know a little bit of a background to the Sikhs and how it all emerged. And as we know that Sikhism was founded by Guru Nanak Dev Ji in the 15th century. And over the years, up to the 1700s, up to the Gurus, 1708, when the last Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, was martyred. Between 1708 and 1765 is a very dark chapter in the history of the Sikhs. Because in India, Mughal power was now declining. And if you look at 1708 to 1765, the Sikhs were persecuted, hunted down. This was a community that survived in the jungles, and yet they emerged into small pockets of guerrilla warfare when it started. And slowly, with the power of the Mughals declining, the Sikhs found an opportunity to unite. And when they united, small factions emerged, which were known as Sikh missals. And for those who don't know what we're looking at is the Punjab region of India. So in this map, it will show you where Punjab is compared to the rest of the states in India. Shows you where China is, Burma, Afghanistan. And we're looking at the northwest of India, the Punjab, the home of the Sikhs and the Sikh community. And it's this area that I'm going to focus my talk on. Before 1765, we look at Ranjit Singh's empire of Lahore up in the northwest. And in this area, between 1708 and 1765 was the Sikh missals. What were the Sikh missals? 12 Sikh missals or confederacies, little principalities scattered across the Punjab. Each missile had its own army, its own leader. Yet, they were all at loggerheads with each other. Each one wanted to expand at the expense of others. Because as we know, when the Afghans were invading India in the 18th century, it was through the Punjab that the invaders used to traverse the lands, pillage the area, and make their way to Delhi and back to Afghanistan and back to Persia. It was the Punjab that was at the forefront of these attacks. Each had an army, each had a leader. Example, the Ahluwalia missile was led by Fateh Singh Ahluwalia. The Pulikian missile, which was the Patiala missile. The Kanhaiya missile, the powerful Bangi missile. Each missile had its own territory, had its own headquarters. The Pulikian missile was Patiala. Ahluwalia missile was Kapurthala. Bangi missile was Amritsar. Kanhaiya missile was Gurdaspur, and so on. But if you look on the missile in red, the Sukar Chakya, this was the missile that was to emerge as the most powerful, because this was the missile of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's family, and it was led by Sardar Charat Singh, Ranjit Singh's grandfather. And he was such a visionary that he managed to kind of take control of certain missiles in the area. The weaker missiles, the Daliawali missile, the Singhpuria missile, these were the smaller missiles with smaller armies. And slowly, the Sukar Chakya missile emerged as the most dominant in the Punjab by the late 1780s, 1770s. But to take on the invaders, take on the Afghans and the Persians, the Sukar Chakya missile became the forefront of all the missile darts. And it was Charat Singh's grandson, Ranjit Singh, aged barely 17, 18, who becomes its leader when his father accidentally dies, Mahar Singh, in 1792. Aged only 12, Ranjit Singh was taught by his uncle all the military tactics of becoming a leader. He practiced using the pistol, the sword. And when he was chosen to lead an invasion to Lahore, aged only 18, 19 at the time, he took control of Lahore in 1799, barely 19. Not only did he unite the Misildars, all of them, into an aristocratic republic, I would call it, into a super army, is a true description of Ranjit Singh, in my eyes. He wasn't a man who used to wear so much jewellery, a simpleton, 2 earrings and a pearl of beads around his neck. And yet people have described him with all these jewelleries and the headgear. He wasn't very ostentatious, a simple man. But I think he was too advanced of his time, because what he went out to do, no one accomplished in India. And even in the early 1800s, British authorities in Calcutta started to take notice of him, because he was slowly expanding his empire. By 1807, he had gone beyond the Sutlej River. And when he takes Lahore, this becomes his headquarters. I wanted to show you this picture because the pavilion on the right is where he used to hold court in Lahore. The top portion has been destroyed, allegedly by lightning, in 1902. But he built this pavilion, and this is where he used to hold court in Lahore for the next 40 years. And I was very fortunate to go down in the basement where they built special chambers underneath where it would get hot in the summer, and he would stay there in the evenings during the summer months. And these underground chambers, if you see them, they are fully decorated with frescoes and artwork and glasswork. So this image was his bedroom. I can see some of the glass work has kind of fallen off from the ceiling, but I can imagine what it looked like when he was staying here. Just to show you the sort of the grandeur of the Sikh court. So by 1807, Ranjit Singh crosses the Satluj River into British Indian territory. The Pulkin states, Patiala, Nabba, Faridkot, they start to panic. Ranjit Singh assures them that I am not going to invade your territory. We are brothers. But they smelt a rat. And the Patiala Rajas, the Nabba Rajas united and invited the British for protection. They saw Ranjit Singh has been an invader. And in my view, this was a mistake and an error that the Fulkian chiefs had made for asking for British, because it gave the British one opportunity. He gave the British to deploy their forces right up to the river Satluj. But Ranjit Singh held certain cities, Firozpur, Ludhiana, in British Indian territory. And on the treaty that was signed in 1808 between the British and Ranjit Singh, he was compelled to go back to the frontier. This meant simple two things. Some people say, well, we shouldn't have signed the treaty. He could have gone all the way to Delhi. But Ranjit Singh was too smart. This gave him recognition by the British that he was the Maharaja of the Punjab, north of the river Satluj. He was free to expand his territory northwards and to the northwest. That was one point. His ministers even kind of criticized him for signing the treaty in 1808. But he saw other territories which were more of a reward. In the early years, we know very little about the courtiers that Maharaja Ranjit Singh enlisted in his darbar. And some of these nobles weren't from the Punjab. They had migrated from the other states of India. Jamadar Kushal Rang, who became the royal chamberlain. Raja Tej Singh, also from the United Provinces, which is today Uttar Pradesh, was the commander of the Sikh army. Finance Minister Raja Dinanath. Other nobles, Raja Dhyan Singh was made Prime Minister of the Sikh court. Raja Gulab Singh was the governor of Kashmir. And Raja Suchet Singh became the Darbar envoy in British India. Coincidentally, I want you to remember these three names, because these three names, these three people, nobles, will appear in Sikh history to right till the end. Not only these three are brothers, but by 1810, 1811, Raja Dhyan Singh was just a trooper on 5 rupees a month. Gulab Singh, his older brother, was earning only 12 rupees a month. And Suchet Singh was working as in the royal fort. The rapid rise of these three men is paramount to the fall of the Sikh Empire. Within 3-4 years of their arrival, especially Dhyan Singh and Gulab Singh, within 3-4 years, they had managed to be promoted to the highest office in the Darbar. I mean, becoming Prime Minister within 4 years of his arrival. Gulab Singh becomes governor just 6 years after his arrival in Lahore. And before we know it, Ranjit Singh now is surrounded by non-Sikhs in the court. There was hardly any Sikh chief working in the court of Lahore in the Darbar. Most of the powerful Sikh chiefs, the generals, were usually posted to far-flung provinces, Peshawar, Kashmir, Hazara, Multan in the south. there was no Sikh that was in the corridors of power. That was one error. But here we have two Sikh generals that are, in my view, are the most trusted and loyal officers of Ranjit Singh. We all know who Hari Singh Nalwa is, and we all know who General Shyam Singh Atariwala was. Hari Singh Nalwa joined Ranjit Singh at the age of 16. Take Kabul on a number of occasions, but Ranjit Singh had always prevented him. On numerous dispatches from Peshawar to Lahore, he requested Ranjit Singh, let me take Kabul. At the height of Sikh power, by the late 1820s, they could have easily walked into Kabul. But Ranjit Singh, for some reason, asked him to withdraw back to the frontier, up to Peshawar. On the other hand, General Shyam Singh Atariwala, his daughter, Bibi Nanki, married Ranjit Singh's grandson, Prince Narnial Singh. And he will be mentioned later. But now we've got 1820s, the Sikh Empire has got an army of around 20,000. Regiments have been formed. Cities like Rawalpindi, Lahore, Amritsar, Jammu, Kashmir, Multan, Naushehra are now part of the Sikh kingdom. But before I just go on to that, this is the fort that Hari Singh Nalwa built right on the frontier, Jamrud Fort. It's still being used by the Pakistani army. I was fortunate to get this image by the helicopter of an aerial shot, and today it is still the same as it was built. Nothing's been modified, nothing's changed. If you look on the left hand side, the little white building, that's the tomb of Hari Singh Nalwa. And the Pakistani army are so proud of this fort that it still serves its purpose. 180 years after it was built? It was built around 1834, 1835. And to see into the basement was an experience I'll never forget. These are just one of the forts that Hari Singh Nalwa built, because Hari Singh, what he did, he built several forts along the frontier with Afghanistan. He wanted to seal the frontier from further invasion. All the credit west of Indus, all the forts, all the palaces west of Indus on the frontier, he was 6 miles away from Jamrud Fort, and yet he was so ill he came to Jamrud Fort. Early 1820s, we have the arrival of Europeans to the court of Lahore. Now Ranjit Singh knew one thing, that the superior British army, the East India Company, are right on his doorstep, the Sutlej River, which is the boundary between the Sikh kingdom and British India. When I mean by British India, I mean all the other states in the Punjab, Malwa, Patiala, Nabba, Delhi and all these other states. And Ranjit Singh knew one thing, that his army needed modernization. And the only way he could accomplish this was through the Europeans. Out of nowhere, his intelligence came to Lahore and said, Your Highness, we have 2 foreigners on the frontier. So he invites these 2 foreigners. And when General Alad and General Ventura turn up in Lahore, they're invited for an audience with Ranjit Singh. And his first question is this: Are you British spies? Have you come to spy on me? He goes, No, Your Highness, we've just come from Persia. We've been serving Mirza Abbas Ali in Persia. We spent 5 years there. We are looking for employment. And Alad states that he used to work for Napoleon. When that word Napoleon crops up, Ranjit gets excited. He goes, You used to work for Napoleon? He goes, Look, I've got a problem. He goes, I've got the superior forces of the East India Company on my doorstep, and my army needs modernizing. Can you modernize my native army to European standards? He goes, Sure we can. He goes, I'm a cavalry officer. And Monsieur Ventura is also a cavalry officer. We've both served Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And to his amazement, he offers them employment. On 500 rupees a month, both men are enlisted, not only to modernize the Sikh army, but to form new regiments on European lines. Now 500 rupees doesn't sound a lot of money today, but at the exchange rate in the 1820s, 500 rupees was a fortune. And to put that in context, I will show you later a receipt. Other Europeans followed. We've got General Avitabile, an Italian by birth. Dr. Honigberger, who becomes Ranjit Singh's personal physician. He was from Transylvania, which is today Romania. Colonel Gardner, Alexander Gardner, the Scottish American, who comes all the way from America, crosses the whole of Europe, Middle East, and ends up in Lahore. Charles van Cortlandt, a Dutch officer. What drew these men to Lahore? What was the reason why all these Europeans were now descending on the frontier to work for Ranjit Singh? When Avitabile was in Persia, he had stories of this decrepit old man who's paying so much money, wants to recruit officers to his army. And so these stories started traveling around Afghanistan, Persia. Because Avitabile wanted to go to Egypt and serve the Egyptian king. Yet they diverted their plans and they entered Lahore. Because the opportunities, because Punjab, by the 1820s, there was no other province in India that was offering employment to foreigners. Punjab was the only province that one could find employment, where opportunities were abundant. And so many, numerous officers turned up in Lahore. This sent alarm bells to the board of directors of the East India Company in Calcutta. Such were the stakes. The stakes were so high then. By the 1830s, 1831, the board of directors issued instructions to their officials posted along the Sutlej River on the frontier to stop or prevent any foreigners entering Lahore, especially of French descent. These were the stakes. Now British knew the power of Ranjit Singh by the 1830s because they had their enemy, the French, in the Punjab. So now a cat and mouse game has begun between the Sikh Empire and the East India Company. The Europeans now are training the Sikh army, and these are some of the regiments. We can't forget the Sikh Akalis, the backbone of the Sikh army. I think the Akalis have not been given due credit, because these were the men who really formed the backbone of the army. They would, at a moment, Ranjit Singh couldn't control them. They were a law to themselves. Nomads, slept where they like, travelled around through the kingdom, and yet when it came to battle, these men were at the forefront of any battle. Kalipula Singh in 1823 is a prime example, who was martyred when 5,000 Akalis took on the Afghans. And you can look at the uniforms now. The Europeans have introduced drill uniforms based on the European pattern. If you look at the Sikh cavalry officers, heavily armed. Now imagine thousands of them charging the enemy. I can imagine the sight, 8 foot high on a horse with all their helmets and the gear on. They stand about 10 foot tall. Can you imagine them charging the enemy at full force? The Sikh cavalry were also known as gochoras, which was a Persian word. which was used in the Punjab. Just want to show you a quick receipt I found with the French families. This is a receipt, 1827. It's dated 1827. It's been sent by our friend here, General Allard, Ranjit Singh's top French officer. He's transferred £47 and 18 shillings via Calcutta to France. The banking house is called Cockerell and Frail and Company, London. £47. I found 87 of these receipts, all for a different amount. £80, £90, £110, £60, £12. Now £47, 18 shillings in 1827 is several thousand pounds. Can you imagine how much money is being transferred from the Punjab in 1827 back to Europe via the banking houses of Calcutta? That's just one officer, and I found 87 receipts, and there were over 110 foreigners working for Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The figures were so high. I mean, £47, and I found another £110 just 2 days later. Don't forget, the Europeans were also exporting Pashmina shawls. Ranjit Singh wasn't paying them salaries by the 1820s. They were making their money from export of shawls to Europe. Just gives you the amount of wealth that was in the Punjab in the early 1800s. And as I said, this is just from one officer that's sending money to France via Calcutta. Ranjit Singh's Darbar. Now, this painting, if you look at Ranjit Singh on his throne, Ranjit Singh never sat on this throne, which is actually in the V&A Museum. Has anyone seen it? You must have seen it, yeah? This is in the V&A, but he never sat on this throne. It was more of a showpiece to show the VIPs, the dignitaries, the British officials used to come. Oh, I don't bother sitting on that. It's just a showpiece. Something that you put on your mantelpiece. He would always sit on a wooden chair, cross-legged. And yet there shows this painting. Can anyone tell me who's sitting on the right? Right to him is little Dalip Singh. To the left of Ranjit Singh in the reddish is his eldest son, Maharaja or Prince Karak Singh. To his left is Sher Singh. To his left is Lal Singh. To his left, in the white turban, is Atar Singh Kalianwala. To the right is Diyan Singh in green. Sher Singh Atariwala in right. To his right, Jamadar Kushal Singh. To his right, Hari Singh Nalwa. And to his right, in the green hat, is Fakir Nuruddin, the health minister. And at the bottom two, we have Beli Ram, the court treasurer. And to his right is Raja Dinanath, the finance minister. This shows the grand court in all its glory. And I suppose that these courtiers would have a pivotal role in the next 20 years when the empire was slowly crumbling. Because half these courtiers became heroes and half villains. What do you know about the wives of Maharaja Ranjit Singh? Now, no one knows the exact figure how many wives he had. I don't know the exact figure. Some say 16, some say 20, some say 30, some say 40, some say 10. Rani Jind Kaur, known as Rani Jinda, Dalip Singh's mother. Rani Maina Khan, who was the mother of Karak Singh, grandmother of Nauniyal Singh. Then we have his Muslim wives. Rani Mora Sakar. This is the lady who completely bewitched him in 1803. Allegedly, they said that Ranjit Singh struck coins in her name. I never found any. But she became so... Ranjit Singh was so addictive to this lady. He was bewitched. He would ride on an elephant throughout Lahore. And he was reprimanded by the Golden Temple priests. Said, "What the hell are you doing? You're a king. and you're gallivanting on an elephant with a non-Sikh. But he was the Maharaja of Lahore. And it's a sad story about Mora because she was so loyal to him. And he was his advisor. She advised him on many campaigns in the early years of Ranjit Singh's career. The other lady, Rani Gul Begum, was also a very, very fascinating lady. And yet they all died very poor. These are just some of his wives I just wanted to show you. By 1839, this is the expansion now, the territorial limits of the Sikh Empire under Ranjit Singh. In theory, if you look at the map of Pakistan, if you take away the province of Sindh, you've got the whole of Pakistan, including Kashmir, including Indian Punjab. That was the territorial limits of Punjab or the Sikh Empire. Stretched west from Afghanistan, north to Russia, east to China and south to British India. Plus, you had the province of Bahalpur, which was paying tribute to Ranjit Singh. It had some independence, but it was paying tribute or tax to Ranjit Singh. A huge chunk by 1839. And this, I think, says it all in one caption: the mighty court of Lahore, done by August Sheft, who travelled from Budapest to Lahore in 1842 during the reign of Maharaja Sher Singh. And Sheft, when he arrived in Lahore, he just couldn't understand the grandeur of the Sikh court. He was mind-boggled with what was happening in Lahore. The people was the generals, the courtiers, the nobles, handsomely decorated in their uniforms. Some of the Sikh chiefs were just wearing jewelry from head to toe. You couldn't even see their faces. And he said, look, if I started to paint each individual, I'll need 5 years in Lahore. So what does he do? He sketches all of them, goes back to Europe, and finishes this painting off, which was titled Court of Lahore. And if you look at this painting, the original painting is in Lahore, in the fort itself. It's 16 foot long by 12 foot, in very bad condition. Yet it shows you the grandeur of the Court of Lahore. Fortunately, if this painting did not survive, we would have no indication what the court looked like. And yet, look at Sher Singh on the horse saluting Hira Singh on the right in yellow. Look at the horse fully decorated with jewels and everything. Look at the Fauji cast in the background. The Fauji cast, if you look between the two horses, there's a regiment in red. That was the Royal Brigade that the French had formed. The Fauji cast, the Royal Brigade by the French officers. This was the elite unit of the Sikh army. All depicted in this painting. If you look at Ranjit Singh under the umbrella, to his right is his grandson Nauniyal Singh, and just behind Ranjit Singh are all his European officers. And I suppose if you can just stand out, General Alad with his parted beard, you can barely recognize him. But it just shows you the opulence and the grandeur of the Sikh court by the 1840s. Can anyone tell me who this person is? Can anyone? Any idea? Mr. Sandhu? Uncle ji, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸੋ?
ਸ਼ੇਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਆ ਗਈ
No.
ਧਿਆਨ ਸਿੰਘ ਲੱਗਦਾ
No.
ਸ਼ੇਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਦਾ ਧਿਆਨ
Mr. Mann? Come 1839, just 2 years before 1837, Ranjit Singh suffers paralytic attack. He's partially disabled. He's sick. Some of his Europeans are now on leave in Europe. And there's chaos in the court. Who will succeed Ranjit Singh? Obviously, the eldest and Karak Singh will succeed him. And yet, by 1839, Ranjit Singh finally dies on the 27th of June. The court treasures are locked up in Amritsar at the Gobindgarh fort. Instructions are sent out to Lahore to lock all the 14 gates. While Ranjit Singh lies on his deathbed, there is confusion who will succeed the throne. And his eldest son, this is Kharak Singh, by the way. I won't say he was a weak king, he was more of a religious man. He did take a lot of intervention in a lot of battles with his father, yet he proved to be a very weak successor. And to put in context, when Ranjit Singh died in 1839, a Russian officer, Colonel Steinbach, who was serving Ranjit Singh, he quoted, and I'll give you this quote, he goes, "I doubt in Europe if there's a court in Europe that possesses the wealth as does the court of Lahore. I have never seen such wealth in the Lahore fort, which I estimate to be several thousand rupees and crores just in cash alone." Does this not include Ranjit Singh's personal property, his paintings, his horses, which amounts to an equal figure? This is just one officer giving an estimation of the court of Lahore, what was Ranjit Singh worth. So he's saying about £20 million in 1839. On his successor, Kharak Singh is now proclaimed king in 1839. But slowly the intrigues and the plots are now starting to brew up in Lahore. He proves to be a very weak successor, and the powerful nobles and the powerful courtiers take advantage. And within 1 year, intrigues by certain factions in the court take their toll, and Kharak Singh is slowly poisoned. Now, let me just explain. When Ranjit Singh died, everyone was loyal. The day he dies, now there are factions within the court. There's hardly any Sikh in Lahore. Hari Singh Nalwa has just died 2 years earlier at the Battle of Jamrud. General Alad has died 6 months earlier from a heart attack in Peshawar. Ventura is on leave in France. There's a vacuum in Lahore. Who seizes the opportunity are now the Dogra brothers. We mentioned them earlier, Dhyan Singh, Gulab Singh and Suchet Singh. These three men were instrumental in taking power in Lahore. And what they do, they started to play off other powerful Sikh chiefs who are still in Lahore with one another. And this leads a series of assassinations where certain Sikh chiefs, relatives of Ranjit Singh, are slowly wiped out in Lahore. And the Dogras, the Dhyan Singh, Gulab Singh now take absolute power. Kharak Singh's son, Narnial Singh, is now proclaimed Maharaja. Now, this is Kanwar Narnial Singh. They say that he had the qualities of his grandfather. Courtiers, certain courtiers stated that it should have been him who should have been proclaimed the Maharaja of the kingdom, not his father. Aged just 21, he was a master in military warfare. He was taught under tutelage of Hari Singh Nalwa. He spoke French. He had the qualities, the acumen of his grandfather, and I think had he been in power, maybe the history of Punjab would have been a different story today. But while he was cremating his father in 1814, 11th of November, he returns to the fort, and suddenly the ceiling comes crashing down on his elephant. Now, witnesses state that he had a few injuries on his head, he was breathing, he was alive, And when Dhyan Singh takes this young boy into his own apartment, locks the door, his mother, Rani Chand Kaur, comes screaming, "Open the door, I want to see my son." Dhyan Singh refuses to open this door. After 8-9 minutes, I've had a debate about this with a lot of history. I think this is a subject that's been debated. Was it murder? Was it an accident? There's some historians are here today. What do you think, Gurinder?
I'm not really an expert in this area. But,
I've spoken to a lot of historians in India.
the main one they do actually say was he was poisoned.
That was correct thing, yeah. Honneberger was also there and stated that he was alive and breathing. Why did Dhyan Singh not open the door to his mother, who was screaming and yelling outside? 2 murders in one day. If we had the internet back then, or TV, this would have been world news. World news. 2 deaths of 2 kings in Lahore. Commotion. I want to show you a place. He died coming through that gate on the left, the Roshni gate. So this is that gate on the yellow, that in white, sorry. That is the Roshni gate. His elephant was coming through this gate. So his elephant turns up after the funeral ceremonies of over of his father Karak Singh. He comes through. This is the actual ceiling that fell down. Now I've seen this. I've been here 100 times. The walls are so thick. Even an elephant couldn't shook it. They're 4 or 5 meters thick, these walls are. The British version is that there was a cannon fire a day before and it had weakened the gates. I don't think so. There's no gates here. These are solid blocks. And the cement they use is no ordinary cement. It's lime plaster. It's like rock solid. And so if an elephant came through this gate and the ceiling accidentally fell on his head, was it pre-planned? Along with Naniyal Singh, Gulab Singh's son also died, Mian Son Singh, but that's collateral damage. Dhyan Singh, the Dogras wanted to wipe out the Sikh family now, and this was the opportunity. That when he survived this incident, the opportunity he found in the bedroom was to strangulate him, because he wanted his own son, Hira Singh, to accede the Lahore throne. So there's the door, there's the Roshni gate, and I don't think that ceiling would go anywhere, even if an elephant was going under it and it kind of collided with the side gates. But that is actually the actual Roshni gate, the scene of the scene of the crime. Here comes another son of Ranjit Singh, Maharaja Sher Singh, another painting by Sheft. Aged only 37, but there's a contest in Lahore now, because Karak Singh's wife is also laying claim to the Sikh throne. On one end we've got another son of Ranjit Singh. On one end we've got Karak Singh, Ranjit Singh's daughter-in-law, saying, hang on, I'm the Maharani of Lahore now. So now there's an internal battle unfolding. Again, we have the Dogras turn up. We have Dhyan Singh supporting Sher Singh, and his brother Gulab Singh supports Rani Chand Kaur's claim for the Sikh throne. So now we have 2 parties claiming for the Sikh throne. One end we've got Sher Singh, one end we have Rani Chand Kaur. After which Sher Singh wins, because the Dogras know that whoever wins, we will always be in power. That was the ultimate game. So Sher Singh turns up on the throne, but he's made a lot of enemies. And 1841 he rules. Come 1843, he's assassinated in cold blood by the relatives of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who alleged that he was not the real son of Ranjit Singh. And so they supported now the young Dalip Singh, who was only barely 7 years old. So 1843, 18th of September, he's also assassinated, along with his 9-year-old son, Prince Pratap Singh, who's hacked to death by the Sandanwalia Sardars, who were the relatives of Ranjit Singh. So, 1843, another king has been assassinated. Now there is complete chaos in the Darbar, a vacuum. Come forward Rani Jinda, Dalip Singh's mother, who decides to take control of the affairs at Lahore. But the Sikh army now being restless. They're not being paid for 3 months. They want their money and they want a bonus. They want a rise. Unable to take on the mighty Sikh army, she's left in a deadlock. Her son's too young. This is a short list of what's going to happen in the next year now. The murder of all the chiefs from 1843 now, most of the Sikh chiefs have been murdered in Punjab. The death of Ranjit Singh's children, within next 2 years, all of Ranjit Singh's children are dead, apart from young Dalip Singh who's 7. So there's 11 children, 10 of them are now being assassinated. 1 survives, and that is Dalip Singh. There's a vacuum in Lahore, and what is about to start is the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Britain, the British East India Company, sees the opportunity. They see a vacuum in Lahore. They send their spies into Punjab. They buy off certain nobles. They collude with officers in Punjab. And when intelligence gets back to Lahore, Rani Jinda cries to the Sikh army that our motherland has been invaded by the foreigners, by the British. She pleads to the Sikh army to go to the frontier and protect your motherland. And who comes to her aid? Again, General Shyam Singh Atariwala, out of retirement, in his late 60s, he rallies the Sikh troops. By that time, the Sikh army was around 70,000 strong, and they marched to the frontier. The British excuse was that the Sikhs have invaded their territory across the Satluj. Act of war. Now it's 1845, December the 17th. This has been a debate ever since. Who violated what? The British state that Ranjit Singh's offsprings, his Darbar, has violated the Treaty of Friendship that they had signed earlier. But it wasn't provocation of war. The Sikhs had only crossed over to their territories, to their enclaves. There were certain enclaves across the Satluj that were recognized by both governments as Sikh dependencies of the Darbar, of the Lahore Darbar. Yet the British made an excuse and said, no, you've violated the treaty, it's an act of war. And so 1845, the Anglo-Sikh wars erupt, starting with the Battle of Mudki on the 18th of December. This is followed by the Battle of Aliwal, Firoz Shah, and the last battle was the Battle of Sobron, which occurred on the 10th of February 1846. Yes, exactly 170 years to this day. Today we are celebrating Sobron Day. The Prince of Wales Regiment in Surrey annually commemorate Sobron Day, because today is the 10th of February. This image is the Battle of Sobron, and this is where Shyam Singh Atariwala was martyred. Allegedly 8,000 Sikhs lost their lives in this battle, compared to 2,300 British. This marked the final phase, or the end of the First Anglo-Sikh War, 1846. Sikhs have lost. There's a vacuum in Lahore. Rani Jinda is now in a very tight situation. There's no Sikh advisor. There's no Sikh chiefs to guide her. she's been given the wrong information by dubious officers at the court who have no interest, no allegiance to the Sikh monarchy. They have no allegiance to the Sikh court. It's all about their own gains. Young Dilip is only 7, barely 7, 8 years old. And the British, after the Sikh wars are over in 1846, they draw up the harshest treaty for him to sign. He's compelled to sign this treaty drafted by Sir Frederick Currie, who in all the 17 articles, in all the clauses, A, Dilip Singh cannot maintain an army. B, he must deport all his foreigners. C, he must give up part of his territory, i.e. the Jalandhar Daub, the Jalandhar territory. And the British must install a resident in Lahore to take control of affairs until his age of 16. That's just the beginning of his downfall. A month later, this is a lithograph where Dilip Singh is asked to surrender himself to the British authorities, to Lord Hardinge, after the Anglo-Sikh wars have terminated. And a young Dilip, barely 8, meets Hardinge on the right in a little village just outside Firozpur to submit himself and his kingdom to the British. And the treaties that follow, the Treaty of Birawal and the Treaty of Lahore, also states that he must give up the Kohinoor. His mother is to be on a pension of 1 lakh rupees per annum. Now, what does a boy of 7 or 8 know about a treaty? I don't understand my electric bill. Never mind a treaty at age 7. He's frustrated a treaty, and yet he is compelled to sign something. And his tragic circumstances are quite unfortunate, because 2 years later there's insurrection in the kingdom. Not only was the Sikh army betrayed by 2 officers, Raja Tej Singh and Lal Singh, we must remember that a lot of non-Sikhs came to Lahore from other parts of India who had converted to Sikhism. They converted only not because they saw allegiance to Ranjit Singh and to the Sikh monarchy. They converted to Sikhism only to advance their own careers, to make their wealth. And people like Raja Lal Singh and Tej Singh, who led the Sikh army to battle, only to abandon the Sikh army. The Sikhs were only lost the battle because they were betrayed by their own officers who were working in collusion with the British. But 2 years later, rebellion spreads throughout the kingdom. In the north, it's led by Raja Sher Singh Atariwale, and in the south by Diwan Mulraj Chopra. And these are 2 photographs of Diwan Mulraj, which are in the National Army Museum. And he was the governor of Multan. By the time when Ranjit Singh died, the Punjab was divided into 2. The north of Punjab was ruled by the Dogras, and the south of Punjab was ruled by this man, Diwan Mulraj. Immensely rich, immensely powerful. He had an army of 30,000 Sikhs in Multan. So when he rebelled, Sher Singh rebelled in the north because they protested against the humiliation of Dilip Singh being separated by the British when his mother was removed from Lahore, put in chains, and Rani Jinnah was sent across the Ravi to Sheikhpura fort. This incensed the old officers of Ranjit Singh's army. that how dare the British separate mother and son? Who are they? I mean, if you look at the whole scenario, the British, Henry Lawrence, who has been made the British resident in Lahore, is so scared of Rani Jinda's influence that he has to separate mother and son. And Dalip Singh wasn't even aware that his mother had been put in chains, sent across the Ravi to Sheikhpura fort, and ultimately to Benares in India. This was the humiliation that the elder Sikh leaders could not tolerate, and so rebellion broke out. This now culminated in the Second Anglo-Sikh War, which erupted at the Battle of Ramnagar, Multan. This is the storming of Multan fort where Diwan Mulraj was held out. Now, I met the family of Diwan Mulraj, who lives in Kenya, and he told me a little story which I want to share. He said that when the British stormed the fort, Diwan Mulraj, some of his officers said, "We have no chance of beating the British, we're surrounded. We have limited weapons, limited gunpowder." But Diwan Mulraj was obstinate that he's going to fight to the bitter end. And when cannons were mounted around the Multan fort, a section of the fort walls were breached by the British. Now, this is the section where Diwan Mulraj stored his gunpowder and his treasures. So when that blew up, and when the British officers arrived at the fort, what do they find? They found thousands and thousands of gold coins scattered everywhere. And all these British officers quickly were filling their pockets in. Now, this is a true story. They filled in their pockets in because Diwan Mulraj was so rich. Gold coins that I've seen on the market in auction houses are going for thousands of pounds. He alleges that the money that was in the fort itself was probably worth, today's money is £2 billion sterling. I don't think that's an exaggeration. But this is the kind of wealth that most of the courtiers of Ranjit Singh held, personal. These officers, these nobles, were not only so rich, influenced, they had their own little armies, 20, 30,000. And so it gives you an idea of the grandeur of Punjab and why the British could not ignore or dispel of taking over the Sikh kingdom. This was just an excuse that they wanted to secure their frontier with Afghanistan. Because a buffer state was already in place, the kingdom of Ranjit Singh. Why they needed to go to war with the British, with the Sikhs, was simple. It was too big of a prize to give up. By hook or crook, they wanted the Punjab. And after the Second Anglo-Sikh Wars, the Battle of Chiliwala, 1849, 30th of January, this was on a monument in Chiliwala, clearly shows you the British forces under Lord Gough and the Sikhs under Raja Sher Singh. And I've noticed that if you look at the Indian Army, I think ranks of the something Indian Army has been erased for some reason. I think it's the British Indian Army. But this is a plaque in Chiliwala today, which is in Pakistan. This was the final battle just before Gujarat. Dalip Singh now, by 1849, the Anglo-Sikh Wars are over. The British have won. Dalip Singh is now in exile in the United Provinces, i.e. Uttar Pradesh. As you know, this picture was done in Osborne House, which is on display there, and he's sent in exile. Rani Jinda has been sent to exile to Benares, and she escapes to Nepal. And the Sikh army now are disbanded by the British. British have annexed the kingdom of Ranjit Singh. Dalip Singh is in exile. And the large Sikh army have not only been disbanded, but now they've been recruited by the British Indian Army. This is one of the early photographs taken in 1858 by an Italian photographer. And you can see the huge turbans the Sikhs were wearing. This was the normal uniform, 15-20 meter turbans, clearly visible. That is the end of my presentation. Just want to thank you once again for listening. I mean, were destroyed and razed to the ground. The remaining powerful Sikh chiefs and the families in Punjab were put on pensions and sent to other provinces in India. They removed the very fabric of the Sikh tenets in the Punjab. Dalip Singh was now in England. Rani Jinda was in Nepal. And not a shed of evidence or shed of trace of his empire was in Lahore. Everything was slowly removed. And the other treasures of Ranjit Singh, which were in the fort, were auctioned off in 1851 in Lahore. It just shows you that this wasn't accidentally done. It wasn't a coincidence that all the sons of Ranjit Singh coincidentally just died. This was a big master plan right from the beginning that the British had set out, that every powerful courtier, noble, even some of the Europeans were dead, assassinated. And I always say that empires don't fall so easily. They are made to fall. There's always a master plan behind a conspiracy. And the British were so clever.
Too. Just wanted to say thanks again to all of you for coming. Bobby has brought with him his book. Is it The Fungus?
No. What we did last November, we did a calendar for an organisation in LA, which is called Seek Point. They do a lot of charity work, and for the last few years they've been asking me to do a calendar. They do a yearly calendar. I did one calendar this year for them, which we launched in California in November. And so there we have, I think, 18 calendars here. So the money all goes to charity, and we've got my first book I did on the Europeans, which is The Lions Ferengis, in red. The new book, Remnants of the Sikh Empire, we're launching that next month, in March and April. I'm launching it next week in India. So there's lots of other events coming, I think. Resham, some other events coming next month?
Yes, in April.
In April?
One is on 3rd of March.
3rd of March. So if anyone's interested in that event, I think, Govinda, you're doing that Sikh initiative on the relics. So if so there's lots of things happening. Try to participate in what you can. It's good to support these events because it just promotes our culture and heritage. My focus is on promoting the heritage and the culture, and that's why I never say no to students and universities, because if I don't do it, no one else is going to do it. And I travel all over the world to give lectures, and my work is really based on these themes, because there's not many people doing this, and I kind of like to ask other people to get involved, more involved, because you know what, this subject, we're just scratching the surface. There's lots more to do here. There's lots of research. There's tons out there. I mean, I started off just by visiting Lahore in 1989, and I ain't looked back. And look where I am today. There's so much out there, and it's so intriguing. And as you know, anything that's on the auction houses today, Sotheby's, Bonhams, anything related to Ranjit Singh, it's like 100,000, 50,000, 40,000, 200,000. It's ridiculous. I wish Ranjit Singh could just wake up for 2 minutes and say, look what you left us. This is your legacy. And this is not just his legacy, this is our legacy. And I think we all, individually, we need to promote and support each other in whatever we're doing on this theme. So that's why I did this calendar for these guys, all free, didn't charge them anything. So if anyone is interested, they're only £10. The Ferungi's book is only £10, and it's all going to charity, not going to my pocket. So let me know if you're interested. You can, help yourself here. And thanks again, once again, for coming down.